A couple of notes for today's webinar. First of all, this presentation is recorded and will be posted online shortly after the webinar is over. All participants will be on mute and webcams hidden. If you would like to ask a question, which you are encouraged to do, please use the chat feature, which shows up as either a box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen or a small icon at the bottom of a list. You'll see that there's a welcome message there right now, and feel free to ask questions using the chat. Today's guest speaker is the Reverend Mark Tremblay, minister at Knox Presbyterian Church in Calgary. Knox has been developing a narrative budget for over 5 years in order to create an atmosphere of generosity. One of the ways it does that is through transparency. Everyone who has donated to the church knows how every dollar is spent. I'd like to welcome Mark, who's going to tell us more about that now.
Thank you. What I want to go over with today as practical tools is not definitive. I think there's many ways to do a narrative budget, and it has to be related to your community, your individual circumstances, and resources. But I wanted to walk you through what Knox Church has done. So I'll talk to you about some of the pieces that I feel are essential to have before thinking about how to create the narrative budget. And then to understand the context of what we've done, I'll take you through the steps of how I've approached it and show you some examples. And there'll be times through the webinar that we'll stop and give you a chance to ask questions for clarification. You've probably heard this phrase that money follows mission. And it's found to be true. But it's also important then that people understand what they're giving to. Because when people understand that, when they have an emotional investment into what they're giving, then being generous towards that is a lot easier. The challenges to presenting somebody with a budget and asking them if they have any questions. I think we've all experienced in our annual reports or annual meetings, what that's like to have people sit there quietly in front of a budget, and maybe one or two people might ask a question related to a line item, but for the most part, people don't know what to say. They don't know what to ask. So by presenting a narrative budget, it's a way of helping the congregation understand budgeting, understand where the money is being spent, and help them ask the questions that they need to ask so that they can feel confident about what the church is doing and how it's doing it. It's not that it has to be simplistic, but we have to be able to talk about our budget and our expenses and our income in ways that are understandable. So I say in simple terms. And we all know that literacy instills confidence, and it's all about telling a more integrated story. When I arrived at Knox, I took the time to do a look at the previous 10 years of how people had given to the church, what that level of income was, if you will, through donations. And for some reason, it had reached a plateau. It had been the same over that 10-year period. So to think about creating a culture of generosity within the church, we decided that one of the things that we needed to do was to talk more about money, not just in the finance team, not just at session, but in the church generally, in sermons, and provide opportunities for people to ask questions about money, to talk about money, to invite people to come to seminars about estate planning or budgeting, or to help them answer questions about wills and things like that. We decided that we also wanted to create a narrative budget to help us talk more about money. And instead of just having one general fund, we decided that it was important that we create 3 funds. And for anyone familiar with Stewards by Design, this was a partial attempt at some of those doors of giving and opening up those other doors to invite people to think about giving in more than one way to the church. So it really begins here, is what's your story? And it begins then knowing what story you want to tell. And I don't simply mean what's the history of the church. I mean, what's your story? Why do people come to your church? We tell a story in our sermons every week about the kind of community we are. We tell stories in our budget about what's important to us and how we plan for becoming who God wants us to be. So the narrative budget should help us tell that story about the congregation, about our mission, and about the reason that we exist. Why are we here? So this simple question, who is God calling you to be, is an important one to be able to answer. Why are people choosing to come here and not a church down the street? Why are they coming here and not somewhere else? Is there something that your church is known for that attracts people to come to that church? To put it more broadly, in the religious landscape of the community, why do people come to your church? And then what distinguishes you from other churches? And these, I think, help us understand the story that we want to tell. So this is related then to our vision, to our core values, to our mission strategy. And this is Knox's vision. It's to be an inclusive Christian atmosphere for spiritual nourishment and caring fellowship. And along with that vision, we have three core values that have been articulated as worship and music, compassion, and justice. And we created these leaves to relate to our core values as well. These are aspen leaves. They're found in the West. But it's also to evoke the burning bush, where the bush at the bottom is green. And as it becomes animated, as it becomes on fire, the flames change in color. They become yellow and then red. So these three core values are anchored in this visual, but also anchored in the history of our church that uses the burning bush as an important image or idea for it to identify itself. We have these three core values. Some churches have more. I don't know that there's any best number of core values to have, but I think the short explanation and as clear as they can be make it easier for people to remember. And these things then go into our decision making, these values. They affect how we make decisions on our committee meetings and in our budgeting. And they affect then how we shape that narrative budget. It's also important to know what your mission strategy is. How are we becoming who we feel God is calling us to be? And that strategy is related to knowing our goals. But at Knox, our strategy is defined by two things, which is nurture and innovate. We take those things that we've been successful at and we strengthen them to try to make them better. But then at the same time, we want to develop them. We want to innovate more. We want to add something new that may be related or unrelated to that activity that is also going to be as initially as an experiment, but hopefully as an innovation that takes us in the direction that we feel we want to go, the direction that we feel we're being called to fulfill being God's people. And surrounding that, then, we have these 5 missional goals, and which provide us, again, a context and a basis for what we're trying to do and to measure our decisions on what we should be doing next and how we, again, approach budgeting and discussions of what we want to do. And again, some people may have more missional goals, some people may have fewer missional goals. I think it's important that to feel that these can change. These are not written in stone. These are things that are meant to be reviewed and should be reviewed because they help us understand who we are. It's also important to know what you can measure. So, how are these core values? How are we living into them? What are the indicators that we're becoming who God is calling us to be? Are these core values or missional directions something that the session has come up with in a moment of insight, or are they really shared in the congregation? One of the tests that I use, one of the things that we measure, is I invite the congregation to reflect on their top 10 in January, their top 10 memories from the year before. And this is last year's top 10. Actually, it's a top 11 because 2 were very close. And put those words into a word cloud. And the incidence of those top 10 indicates the size of them on the word cloud. But they also help us understand whether or not the core values of the church and the priorities of the church are what we think they are. And so when it comes to worship and music, we see the prevalence of music and church and sermons and the Christmas pageant and our Christmas Eve celebration. And we also see the concern for compassion and justice that's indicated in the inclusive celebration and decisions, and also the expansion, the widening of our circles of friendship in our missional goal through our yoga, through our red carpet concert series, and through our cafe that's hosted in the church. So this has not been a firm test, but it has been a helpful test for us to see how we're living up to who we feel God is calling us to be. So as a quick summary, as a background of why we do this, it's important to know your story. It's important to understand how you're promoting your story. What's your strategy? And it's also then to look for measurables along the way so that you can know how you're judging, how you're reaching milestones along that way. That's a quick introduction, and I thought I'd take just a couple minutes to find out if anybody wanted to ask a clarifying question about the foundation of what goes into how I developed a narrative budget. You're on mute.
Thanks, Mark. Just a reminder that if you want to ask a question, just use the little chat box down below, and you can ask a question anytime. I'll be monitoring them.
Okay, we can move on then. So the question about developing a narrative budget relates to then our financial statements, right? How can our financial statements help tell our story? Again, related to core values and missional direction. So it's important then to look at your financial statements. Are there ways in which your story, the ideas that represent who your congregation is, can you categorize them on your budget in any way? Are there ways of organizing those statements that can help tell that missional story that reflect the core values or strategic direction? This organization should be meaningful to the story you're trying to tell, and you don't have to separate funds the way we did, but how can you explain how you fund the different ministries of your church? So it does require taking a closer look at your own financial statements to see if there's any way you can organize it in a creative way. So then it's to create a set of statements that help tell that narrative, and I'll have some examples in just a couple slides, but also to create features. So there may be some things that you want to lift up to help tell your story. So one of our core values is worship and music. So I thought it was important then that everybody understand what an average worship service cost. So I'll show you that graphic as well. So to encourage the increase in givings or to create a generous atmosphere, I said we created these 3 funds. So they ended up being a general fund. We separated out Presbyterian sharing so people could give directly to that rather than that just coming out of that one big pot. And we also created this building maintenance and reserve fund so people can give directly and exclusively if they wish to any of these, But if they only want to support, say, the keeping the lights on and keeping the heat on in the church, we've made that possible. Additionally, we created 5 different parts of our narrative budget: worship and music, teaching and nurturing, and these then our outreach to community ministries, which is our local missions, and then wider ministries, which is to the church or the missions ministries beyond what our local ones are, and then also our building. So we can look at the breakdown of those costs. So along with these ideas of these 5 different areas, I created, before I get to that, I wanted to let you know what software I used. Spreadsheet program, obviously, for being able to look and categorize the income statement. I use a word processing program to help create the graphics. We use mostly Microsoft products, but I've also used OpenOffice, and Google Docs work well as well. It's important to be able to manipulate graphics, to remove backgrounds, to create pictures that you can use that will help people remember, like the leaves that we have for our core values. And then I use PowerPoint or a presentation software a lot to create those graphics and pictures. It was, I found out that you can really create easily in PowerPoint pictures either in PNG or a JPEG format that enables you then to insert those graphics in other things. So these are the 5 graphics that we created that relate to the different parts of our budget: worship and music, building, nurturing, community, and support of our wider ministries. And these then appear on all our statements, on all our stuff to help anchor that idea of what part of the budget or what part of the financial statements we're talking about. This is a breakdown, or rather a picture, of what my spreadsheet looks like. So you'll see these 5 categories are highlighted. I have last year's and this year's column relating to what the summary is of these 5. You'll see at the top I've got them all together as a summary, and then I've broken down how each category relates to that particular section. So it's clear, it's easy to track it. So I take worship and music. You can see that 30% of my total package, not just my stipend, but the cost of the church. And then 40% of our church administrator's salary is for worship and music. These percentages are based on how our HR committee allocated the costs when we hired our church administrator. And when the church called me, they had a breakdown of what they felt was going to be the percentage of time that I would spend in different areas as well. So I used those as the basis of creating this. The total music ministry expenses are included in this, and then some admin expenses, building and grounds, to help us understand what the total cost of what our worship and music is. So these are done for each of these 5 areas, and you'll see at the below the summary, we've got our total figures, and then there's a 0 below that. And that 0 is my check that I've got everything in there, so that the total adds up the columns, just lines just above it. But the 0 takes the line on our income statement that is the total and subtracts it from this total, so I know I've got all of the material, all of the expenses included here. So then these translate from this kind of breakdown into these visuals that are part of our annual reports. So at the top of this, first off, you'll notice that we have our mission statement, our vision in the top right-hand corner. You'll see in the center at the top, we have that it's the annual general meeting. And this is part of a section of our annual reports that is called Funding Our Ministry. So all our financial reports are in this section of our AGM report. Our other 2 sections are evaluating our ministry, and celebrating our ministry. So I've tried to present them in a way that makes them more usable and more user-friendly for people to refer to. Underneath that header, you'll see what the proposed budget is for this section. And then I have a breakdown of what everything is included in this budget that's being concerned for worship and music. What are the things that are covered in here? And then below that, you'll see, first of all, the pie graph, which has the worship and ministry portion pulled out, so people can see what that is in relation to the other four sections of our budget. And then an actual breakdown on the left-hand side of how that's taken off the financial statements, so people can see that. And then underneath, again, an explanation of what percentage of our budget that accounts for, and how many services that we're including when we break down that average cost. And on this one as well, you'll also notice that we've noted the volunteer commitment, that how many people it takes each week that may contribute to the development of our worship service. I went through that one more completely. I'm not going to go through them all that way, but I'll just show you the other ones. On the right-hand side, you have our nurturing and teaching ministries and how that's breaking down. You see they look very similar, different pull-out on the pie chart, but people then can help predict what they can look for and what it covers. Then we move down to our community ministries and the support of our wider ministries that we've used. Again, showing the relation to the other four categories. And then finally, our building, in terms of what that annual budget is and what portion of the budget that is. So percentages, actual portions, actual dollars, and showing what it covers. So that people then can ask more about any parts of these that they feel that they may want clarification on. And then there's some of the features. So in this one, what I've done is shown the overall look of the income and expenses in relation to our 5 ministry categories. So you'll notice that they're ranked from highest percentage to lowest percentage. This was an actual for 2017. And so the actual dollars are shown and the actual percentages to the overall budget. So that this helps people understand visually how much are we giving away, how much are we investing in our church education and in people within the congregation, how much is going to expand that circle of friendship that we talk about into the community, and what's the actual cost of running the building in relation to say our renters or relation to the other groups that may use the church. I also create then what the projected expenses and income will be for this year. So this is what it looks like for 2018. And one of the things you notice is an increase in our community membership or community ministries. And that has been an intentional investment over the last few years to help us improve or widen that circle of friendship. And so we're starting to be able to place money in that budget to be able to reach out more to the immediate community around the church. Thought we could take another few moments if you had any questions about those visuals. I know that's going through quite a lot. There may be specific questions you have. It'd be a time to ask those now.
There hasn't been any questions on the chat feature yet, Mark.
Okay. I'll move on. So this is one of those features. You know, the budgeting doesn't always have to be a dull and boring thing. Sometimes it can be interesting and fun. So this is what our breakdown of what a cost of a service of worship will cost this year. And I've got the music costs, I've got the minister's cost, and a breakdown of how many volunteers in relating to where does this go, and what are we spending $2,000 a service on. So people can see what the impact of having choral scholars and an organist and a choir director. People can understand it's not just lights and heat. There are other things that's involved in the building, and that there are administration expenses that go into this. So they can see that actual breakdown in relation. Some of these graphics are good and interesting. Some of them are just grabs from the internet. You can be as creative or not as you want. Again, I emphasize it has to be appropriate for your community. It has to work for the people that you're wanting to help know more about the finances and how things are spent and done in your church. The gown that I wear is changed every year. It's whatever graphic I can find. Another feature that we do is how much does the minister cost? What does the minister spend his time on? And how does that relate to the ministry areas of our church? So I've shown how that is done and what that costs, the percentages for that. So people don't have to worry about, or rather they don't have to not understand how my time and the cost of my time in each of these places. I think it's also important to track your volunteer time, your volunteer hours. We ask our volunteers to let us know how much time they're spending on church work, so we can understand what the human investment is in our ministries as well. We know that a church can't run without volunteers, and we should know and we should be able to report how much time people are spending on church activities. So we developed this volunteer tracking form that asks people to tell us what they did and how much time they spent, and travel time as well, and then to add up those total hours. Some people take time at their committee meetings to do this, and other people hand it in at other times. But once we have those hours, we can categorize them in our ministry areas, and we can produce a graphic that shows this, what those ministry areas are and where the bulk of our volunteer hours come. So a total of almost 13,000 hours related to about 7 full-time positions that are distributed in our ministry areas, as you see. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we do is to create opportunities to talk about money, giving, and generosity. One of the things we did 3 years ago in the fall was to have a conversation cafe. We invited people to come for the cafe. I think we had a light lunch for them after church. And then we had these structured questions. It's a structured conversation relating to generosity and to the questions about the church. Sometimes we have to help people ask questions because they don't know what questions to ask. So we spent probably just under an hour in this conversation, about 20 minutes per question. And we had people in small groups around tables and gave them the opportunity to talk individually in their groups and then share some of those insights with the larger group. And that was really helpful to help people participate in a question about money in a less threatening, more inviting way. And you'll see the data on this is 2015. And there's something that we learned about our process of narrative budgeting and the opportunities, or the need to create these opportunities to talk about this. 2015, we talked the most about money. That was the year that we were better at it. The last couple of years, we slacked off a little bit. We didn't create quite as many opportunities. We didn't talk quite as much about it. Consequently, our givings let down a little bit. So one of the things that we learned from keeping track of that historically is that we need to maintain that level of engagement with the congregation to be able to talk about our ministries and talk about our story. Now, I guess maybe I've gone fast, but that comes to the end of this, and here's our summary, that the statements that we create have to help tell our story. And that from those statements, we should be able to create feature infographics that tell one part of that story. It's really important to track volunteer hours, and it's as equally important to make time to talk about money. And that, I think, is my last slide.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, is there anyone that would like to weigh in with a question for Mark while we have him? It looks like Karen is saying where to start, saying it's also good, which is great, and a little overwhelming. I totally agree. So where to start, Mark? Do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I don't want it to seem overwhelming. I mean, it doesn't have to be as complex as what we've done. I think, nor do you have to feel that you're going to get it right the first time. You know, we've been developing this for 5 years, and each year it's taken a little bit. It's developed, and I think it's important just to start, and to start with knowing what your story is, and then finding a way to structure your narrative budget to help you tell that story. How are you budgeting for being the people that you feel God is calling you to be? And that's the place to start. Looking at those income statements and how you can categorize them that relate to what your mission priorities are, what your core values are, seeing how you can overlay those things together to come to something that makes sense to you for telling your story, and then share it with people. Test it out. Don't assume that it's a single person project. I mean, it can be a community project of a committee or a larger group asking these questions and looking at your statements and seeing how you can categorize them to help tell your story in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Mark. There's another good question about asking if anyone complained about all the extra talking about money.
Surprisingly, no. People expressed gratitude for being able to have opportunity to ask questions in smaller groups rather than in the large group, because that was intimidating. And they appreciated the extra information and extra time that we've been taking to help explain the budget and help explain our expenses. So they really had a better grip on and a clear understanding of what we were trying to do.
Great. Okay. There's another question about asking to hear more about the processes you use to reach your mission statements and core values.
When I arrived, the congregation had a couple different vision statements that were floating around, and the core values were there, but they weren't clearly articulated. So having spent some time with the session and looking at vision and mission and values, we were able to clarify those so that we weren't sending mixed messages, and that we were also clear among ourselves as to what we were talking about. And I think that's probably true in most churches. They have a sense of what the local church is about, but it's not really clearly defined or presented. And it's just a matter of clarifying that and honing it so that when everybody hears it, they say, of course, yes, that's exactly who we are.
Okay, great. And another question about asking if your treasurer makes up your budget and does the graphics.
Our treasurer creates the budget, and I'm the one that's created the graphics. And the treasurer and I work cooperatively now to work on the budget. In fact, it's a committee that works on the budget. So the budget is more of a communal thing, and then the graphics are the ones that I developed a few years ago, and we've just kept reusing them and changing them a little bit.
Great. Okay. And another question about, do you still provide regular budget / financial statements in your annual report, or you present narrative?
Yeah, of course. Both sets of statements are present. The narrative budget statements are alongside the line item budgets or line item consolidated statements.
And I guess part of that same question is do you present the narrative at a different time of year?
We don't, but we probably should. And certainly the welcoming or inviting ways in which those sheets are done invites that and enables that opportunity to be able to talk about them at different times. Like, for example, through a conversation cafe or in a newsletter, you could highlight one part of the budget that way. It's something that we're talking about this year to do because of the fact that we stopped doing it over the last couple of years.
Okay, great. I'll give it a second here to see if there are any other questions that come through. Those are some really good ones. Okay, can you just say a few words, Mark, about why the record of volunteer hours is so important?
Well, it on a couple of levels. First off, it shows us how engaged people are in their church. It shows us what the human investment in giving back to the church also is. We know that corny old phrase, time is money. And people give very generously to the church in many different ways. And we're not only interested in how much money people give to the church, we're also interested in what time they give to the church as well. And if we don't track those hours, how do we know? If we don't ask people to help us understand what they're giving to the church, then we can't understand how much time it's actually taking to perform our ministries and to engage in these ministries. So I think it just speaks to part of our stewardship of people to know what kind of hours are being spent on church ministries.
Great. And any other final questions that anyone would like to ask? I think you've given people a lot to think about, Mark.
Well, I hope so. Thank you.
All right. Well, it looks like there aren't any other questions. So we'll leave it at there. Mark, do you, I'm guessing if people they could contact you if they wanted to talk to you directly. Would that be possible? Yeah,
sure. I'm available on email. I may not get to it quickly, but I will get to it. I get a lot of emails, so that's one way to contact me.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been a really good discussion, and I hope it's been helpful. All right. Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Okay. Thank you, Barb.
Take care.
And good luck.